Muy buenas noches, bienvenidos a Casa
Good
Árabe.
evening. Welcome to Casa
Conferencia
Árabe
de mesa
and
redonda para
to this
hablar
panel discussion on the Arab Dawn, youth and the demographic dividend. 1 out of every 5 Arabs is between 15 and 24 years of age. And these young people, despite the political structures that limit them, do have
ayer cumplió cinco
power.
años,
Yesterday
se conmemora el
was the
25 de enero,
anniversary of January 25th, the beginning of the Egyptian Revolution, when the young people got organized and went to Tahrir Square, and for 18 days they surprised the world precisely with that ability to organize themselves and take a public space with all sorts of challenges, security, health, information, and so on. And now that we, have just had the most recent Star Wars movie featured. It's not that the Force is with them, but there are. But this could be a situation in which Arab societies could be coming across new social and political changes, cultural changes that enables it to leave the past menu offered by the media, sectarian and confrontations, radicalism, economic stagnation, geopolitical conflicts. That's what's in the media, but very rarely do we hear that there are more young people enrolled in university in the Palestinian territories than in Hong Kong, and that 1/3 of entrepreneurs in Lebanon are women entrepreneurs. And it's refreshing to know that despite the differences between them, the Arab youth, which is very diverse socioeconomically, they do share very many things in common on political governance, economic management, or education. The premise for the Arab Dawn book is that the Arab youth is more and more educated, cosmopolitan, tech savvy, and there's a growing class of urban women who are agents for change. According to the author, Bessma Momani, Arab societies today offer a demographic possibility that she calls dividend that needs to be nurtured. And the changes in the cultures, cultural attitudes in the rural Arab world is also considered in her book, and that should be taken into account, and its effects giving shape to the Arab elites, and how it gives shape to the societies in these new countries, and the distribution of wealth and power relations. And these chapters also refer to concepts that in everybody, in the collective imagination, bred liberty, identity, and circularity, and a constant feedback between the Arab world and the West, with effects on the Madrid May 15th and Occupy Wall Street movements. Bessma invites us to leave behind rapid conclusions to understand the social dynamics of the Middle East that are underlying, and that these are tectonic forces that are not in the radar of the news, and that enable us to think of a new time. Let's listen to Bessma Momani. She's an associate professor in the political science department in the University of Waterloo in Canada. And with her are two distinguished experts in the Arab world here in Spain, Leila Nachawati, professor of communication at the Universidad Carlos III, Madrid, and co-founder of the portal Syria Untold, and Haizam Amirah Fernández, main researcher for the Mediterranean and the Arab world at the Real Instituto Elcano think tank. We'll first listen to Bessma, then to Haizam and Leila, to after wrap up with your questions, concerns, and remarks.
Bessma, adelante, por favor.
Bessma, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'll be speaking in English. but I hope that some of the slides might help. So, thank you all for coming. I wrote this book, and I was mentioning this to my co-panelists earlier, that I wrote this book. It was a labor of love, and I think that, if anything, it was meant to describe a region that is so often forgotten, and I think it's forgotten for all there are so many beautiful things about the region that are often ignored, and so many things that may be wrong that are perhaps highlighted so much by our Western media that we forget that sometimes there's even people in the region. It seems like it's all riddled with war and conflict. I want to say something before starting, in that I don't want to belittle the conflict. This is not to say that there aren't serious challenges. There are. All I want to say is that we need to focus on the 99.99% that are living, that are not radicals, that are the hope of the future, and there's something positive going on with young people that keeps me quite optimistic. So we all know that there's a great deal of intergenerational change. This is a message that I want to come out in my book. And I think, as a frequent traveler of the Middle East, and as many of my colleagues as well who frequent the region know, there's something profoundly different about this generation than previous generations. And this is something that I wanted to capture. You know, many of the women that I would speak to in particular might have been the women of my generation that I remember, they were friends of mine 30 years ago. The way they think is fundamentally different than their children. Their daughters, I think, are refreshingly much more challenging of authority than their mothers ever were. The way they think about life is in new and optimistic ways that I think are often forgotten. I think that one of the messages of the book is that even though, and we can have a debate, this is a whole other debate, whether or not there was even a political revolution called the Arab Spring. Was it a revolution? Was it not? Was it a moment? Was it an uprising? Is it a winter? I mean, we've heard that constant debate, and it's really not to be solved in this hour or perhaps years to come. But I think there's a social and cultural revolution happening now. So even if the political revolution, for all its positive or negative, this is not an indictment on whether or not we should have one, is to say that we have a social and cultural revolution, and youth are the agents of those change. And what I wanted to do was to really bring out what's happening. The book points out there's a great deal of challenges happening in the region, and changes, I should say. One of being a great deal of entrepreneurialism. The quest for economic opportunity, by far, is something that I think so many young people continue to express, that they're not given opportunity. They want to excel. They want meritocracy. They want to shine. They want to be given the opportunity to shine. And I think that's fundamentally different than previous generations, which was a more passive view, thinking that they needed to wait for government to come give them job number 1, 2, 3, 4. This generation is not waiting on the government to give them job 1, 2, 3, 4. In fact, they've bypassed the government. They don't think of the government as a savior. They think of the government as an impediment. I think this generation is much more attuned to thinking about political freedom. And one of the things, as a political scientist, I think we failed in many of those who study the Middle East, in that we didn't predict the Arab Spring, right? I mean, if we were, as political scientists, the ones who should understand, if we have, even if you can call it a science, we should have been able to see something, right? And I would say most of those who did see what was going on and reflected on it were often journalists, were often anthropologists, but they weren't the political scientists. And that's because we were focused on things like political parties. We were looking for civil society organizations. We had certain tools or certain markers and metrics of what we thought was political liberalization. But what we failed to look for was the discussion, the conversation. And if you looked at what was happening online, the conversation was very political, revolutionary, and I think that's where we need to focus if we're going to have an understanding of political freedom. And I really pick up on the work of Asaf Bayat and his everyday politics. I think that really the Arab region, there's a sense of protest in everyday existence that we don't capture in our tools, particularly as political scientists, and that's sort of a mark on my profession. The region, I think, is much more cosmopolitan. You know, I think we have this mentality of the Arab world being split into debates about religion and secularism, and those are two dichotomies, and it's a polar opposite description of a region, and most of the Arab youth are just tired of that kind of narrative. It's very much an imposed Western narrative. They think of themselves as hybrids. They neither see themselves as completely Western or completely Eastern. They see a fusion. And that's something that kept coming up in my research and findings with youth. Okay, we all see this. We know this story of Arab youth being an important segment of the society and population, 60% or more of the population. One of the things, our youth, one of the things that I want you to think about, and this is where me particularly as a political economist, I look at this and I see growth. I see economic opportunity. We know in economic history, if you're going to have a successful society, you need young people. If you're going to have a society that will innovate, produce, save, create, you need young people. You cannot do this on the backs of older people. We know that there's a crisis in Japan today. As a global political economic analyst, if you look at what's happening in Japan, it's an economic crisis. They cannot function on the median age of their society being 65 years old. If we look at the Western world, it is aging quite rapidly. The median age is getting older and older. And this is something, being here in the heart of Europe, I have to say that this is something when we talk about migrants, we talk about people coming, I deplore you to think about them as economic agents of positiveness to your society and to your economies. To grow, you need to have young people. There is a reason why I think the German chancellor was smart to look at why so many of those refugees were beneficial to her country economically. Okay, that's the key word. So one of the things that makes me optimistic as well is that these young people are going to be the future decision makers. You know, I had the great pleasure of meeting so many smart people who really should be in political office, but weren't. And, you know, they were frustrated, you know, that when the median age of the Arab youth is in their 20s, you know, they're often frustrated because they don't have political say. They don't have political power. And I often tell them, you know, I know it's really easy to be dismissed when you're 20, but trust me, when all of you are all 35 and 40, no one is going to ignore you. You will be the decision makers. So what I'm saying is looking at the young Arab youth that I had a chance and opportunity to meet across the region, knowing that these individuals will be in power, the way that they think, and is so refreshingly, I think, better than previous generations, is a source of optimism for me. One of the things that I think has not been an important or enough highlighted part of the story is how educated Arab youth are. And I want to point out that there's a great deal of studies, and I can't help but see Haizam here has a very good book on generation and waiting, which is a really fantastic book. There's a lot of problems of quality. I'm not going to ignore the reality that there's a quality problem. I think Arab education needs to be improved vastly. But one of the things that Arab youth in their education that has made them very confident, and that confidence doesn't go away or, frankly, diminish based on the quality of the education you have. That's really important here. So it's not just about Arab youth having degrees. That's important, but it's the confidence. I mean, one of the things I found repeated, and I think that Karim rightly pointed out that some of these things of similarity is not what I expected to find, but I kept hearing from young people across the region, from Rabat to Cairo to Amman to Dubai, this argument that I am educated, I know things, I deserve to be in that political office to make change for my society. I know things, I want to contribute to my society. I will not accept the idea that somehow that person in the parliament knows better than me. They're not there because of their merit. Right? This is really interesting. It's that confidence, right? That's not what we heard 20, 30 years ago from the generation of people that I remember very well as friends and as colleagues. This generation has confidence. I mean, confidence almost to a fault, but they have confidence. And I love that. That says something about this society that has created this generation of wanting and expecting better. And if there's anything that you can take from the Arab Spring, is that it was all the things that we heard, call for bread, for freedom, for dignity, but it was saying, I deserve better. And that really stood out to me, this argument that I deserve better. And it's not just deserving better because I have some sort of God-given right. It's because I'm educated, right? I deserve better because I know things. I'm educated. I can contribute. That confidence is something that, a spirit that I saw throughout the region that is really quite remarkable. You know, the Arab region has been investing in education, and I think quite successfully. And again, there's a lot of quality concerns, so I'm not going to diminish that. But we've seen a doubling of universities in the past 10 years, really quite remarkable. Arab governments have put a lot of money into education, post-secondary education, perhaps even, I think, at an expense of primary education, but nevertheless, a lot of post-secondary education. We have some of the statistics that I think always blew my mind. 77% of Emirati women have a university degree. I mean, these are numbers that in the Western world we would only dream of. This image of somehow, I remember this Gulf women being these repressed women. When I went to the Gulf and talked to them, they are so confident, they are so emboldened, they are so ready to change the world. And I think this is something that we need to give people credit for in the region, that they did create a very educated cohort that wants different things. Entrepreneurialism is on the rise. And this is something I want to be careful because you get very comfortable into what is called World Bank speak. People talk at the World Bank about entrepreneurialism as this panacea for everything. And we have to be careful. And as a political scientist, I see the inherent political dimension of that. This is basically saying to governments, governments, it's not your fault that your society is not functioning. It's basically because, you're not, in Arabic we say gada'an, or you're not being, this spirited person of going forward and working hard, that entrepreneurial mantra. That's not the point, okay? I criticize that. I don't want that to be the argument of me pointing out about entrepreneurialism. The focus on entrepreneurialism is because previous generations did wait for the state to deliver. This generation is not expecting the state to deliver. In fact, they see the state as an impediment. At the end of the day, this is a criticism, okay? It's a criticism of government's failures to provide jobs, to provide the economic growth, to provide inclusive economic growth, really important here, because that's, I think, a big problem. It's not about just shiny towers and malls. It's about creating an economy that is actually productive. And that's something that Arab youth want desperately, is productive work. One of the things that I found that was really quite remarkable, and Karim noted this as well, is that the attitudes about entrepreneurialism, if we take the global attitudes, some of the highest, most positive attitudinal voices towards entrepreneurialism came from the Arab world. By far. I mean, so, in many parts of North America, in Europe, people are hesitant to start a business. There is this perhaps social, people look at it as being risky. Oh, well, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you go for a secure job? In the Arab world, the social attitude, and I tell you, this did not exist 20, 30 years ago. The attitude toward an entrepreneur today in the Arab world is that this is a person who's creative, innovative, strong-minded, and very much supported by much of his or her society. That's unique and different, and this is again based on really interesting statistical analysis. The only other comparable region was actually Africa, where we saw this again, great admiration, social admiration for entrepreneurialism. Again, I think that's really quite interesting. The fact that we have connectivity in the Arab world reaching almost 100% in some places is phenomenal. This is something that I think we all forget. We all look at our phones as something that perhaps just is a toy, but this is a modern computer in the hands of people. And the fact that you have, in some places of the Gulf, 85% connectivity, in parts of the Levant, more than 50% connectivity. I mean, I just came back from Luxor, one of the most, poor area of Egypt, and there were school kids coming in to check out Luxor. And now, these were, 10-year-old kids. I'm not saying that they all own the smartphone. It may be their parents' smartphone. But the number of young kids who could barely say, as I was walking by, hi, 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 just practicing their English. Here are these kids from rural areas taking pictures on these smartphones, looking up different things on their phones. This is power in the hands of people all over the region. And what is that power? That power is not just to be able to search the internet. It's also to question your government. One of the things that people don't know, one of the highest users per capita in the Arab, or so I should say in the world, are Saudis. I mean, Twitter, number of people on Twitter from Saudi Arabia exceeds per capita anywhere else in the world. The number one place of uploading videos anywhere in the world is in Saudi Arabia. okay? And that content is critical. It's not necessarily, and this is really interesting, it's not criticize necessarily the monarch. We know there are red lines, and people are not going to be able to go that far. But they're doing things like hashtag Jeddah floods. And you say, well, what's that? That sounds nefarious, or I should say apolitical, but it's very political because they're criticizing the lack of services. This has become an important way of criticism of government. So you're no longer providing, but you better start providing services. Where is my services? That sort of quest for accountability is something that I found in Arab youth that is really prominent. And so one of the things that we need to do, even as political scientists, I have to say, we failed in finding the sources of, let's call them political protest, because we were searching for all the wrong things. We're waiting for protests on the street, we're waiting for political parties, civil society organizations. What we didn't do was look at the fact that people are online debating their governments and saying, I deserve better, right? That's really important. I mean, some of the other things that I found so interesting are blogs. Blogs are really widely read in the Arab region, 50% of which are written by women. These are the kinds of things that we don't hear about so often. Also, one of the things that I think we don't realize is that there is still a high quest for democracy. 92% want democracy. This is something that I think we too often forget when we talk about the Arab world. We sort of assume that they've given into this so-called autocratic bargain, that somehow they will accept the dictator in exchange for stability. That is not something many of the young people I spoke to were saying, why do I have to choose between one or the other? I mean, this is not, that's a false choice. I don't think that there's, a reason why we have to put those in those stark terms. Again, my favorite, I think, perhaps a sort of awakening to me, and I say this very personally because it was something I didn't expect to find, was this hybrid identity. Arab youth are tired of being told you're either Islamic or you're Western, and choose between the other. And there's all these tropes of things that are assumed with one or the other. And one of the things that kept coming out is no, young people are rejecting that. Unlike their parents, I would say that I often met the mothers of the young people were perhaps friends of mine 20, 30 years ago. In some cases, they were reunions of people that I knew when I would go to the Middle East in my youth. And these are women who did, they had to choose between one or the other. And sometimes it was about socioeconomic class that allowed you to choose which of these you were. If you were in an elite political or economic elite status, you could choose to be very Western. You couldn't necessarily choose a Western lifestyle if you came from a rural area. The pressure to put on a hijab, often was really quite strong. This generation, I would find all these, I think interesting women that would say to me, particularly in, more elite circles, I fought to ensure that I didn't have to wear a hijab, and now my daughter or my granddaughter wears it. What's going on, right? And young people, then I would talk to the granddaughters or the daughters, and they would say, my grandmother, my mother is from a different generation where they had to choose. I don't have to choose. I want to be very Western and I want to be Muslim. Right? And that hybrid identity is something that we need to come to terms with to understand it. And the one way I see it most eloquently is in fashion. So the young Arab woman who wants to wear hijab, but from as my good friend of mine said, from the neck down, it's from Zara, it's from Mango, it's from H&M. There's my hijab, there's my Western culture, and I want everything else that comes with it. Right? That's interesting. That's something that we need to start changing our mentality about, rather than seeing everything in these dichotomous terms. One great thing that I found in my study, 64% of Saudis want to marry for love. I think there's no greater statistic that made me happy than hearing that. In a place where there's official segregation of the sexes, can you imagine? You are completely segregated, no mixing allowed, and yet 64% of young Saudis want to marry for love. That's important. That says I have an individuality. I want to be respected as a person. My opinion and my future spouse matters to me. That's something that we need to think about. This is a young generation that has a very different expectation. I guarantee you their parents did not only not marry for love, had no choice. This is the important change that's happening in one of the most autocratic, I think, most outlier Arab states of the entire region, where it's the only country that has officially segregated the sexes. Another thing that I want to say, and this is where I want to give you some hope, because it is really about if we look at the outliers, I mean, one of the things I guess as a political scientist we're often told, if you can show change, at the extreme, then what does it say about the rest of the region? So Saudi Arabia to me is in many ways that extreme. It does represent, I think, one of the most, let's say, challenging places in terms of society, great deal of religiosity. And one of the things that I found fascinating about Saudi Arabia and why I think actually there is a social culture revolution happening in Saudi Arabia today that is absolutely revolutionary. Society and culture is changing. Think of this. Every year, the Saudi government sends young people to study abroad. The King Abdullah Scholarship Fund, I think one of the best investments any Arab government has made in their youth. It told their young people, go abroad, get an acceptance letter from a Western university. We will send you there. We will pay for your travel. We'll pay for your stay, and come back with a Western degree. Today, there's 90,000 students every year going to going to the United States. 20,000 in Canada, 20,000 in the UK. This year, there are more women than men. Last year, it was 48%. The year before that, 43%. The program started in 2005. It's funded through to 2020. I spoke to these young women not only when they were in the West, but also when they went back. Okay? And these young women are saying things to me like, I lived by myself. I know that's controversial, but many of them are living alone. I lived by myself. I studied. I obviously fended for myself. I learned how to be an independent person. I'm going back to my country and I'm being told that I can't change my cell phone plan without my guardian. Are you kidding me? That kind of, unbelievable type of imposition on women today is being challenged from the bottom up. And Saudi women, I think, are a huge source of revolution in their country. And I meet these women all over the world. One of the things that's so wonderful about being able to talk at universities is seeing these Saudi women who are able to say, I'm changing my society from within. I'm going to go back as a lawyer, I'm going to go back as an engineer, and I'm going to change my country from within. That's the kind of revolutionary change that's happening that we're not focusing on. If we only focus on what's coming out of the Saudi political establishment, we would get only a very narrow perspective of the world. So one of the things I wanted to do was really just to give voice, amplify the voice of these young people that I think are doing some really interesting thing. So they are a dynamic new generation. I think that they are optimistic global citizens, and the Arab Spring, if anything, is just the beginning. Thank you.
Shukran, Bessma. Gracias.
Thank you, Bessma. I'd now like to give the floor to Leila Nachawati.
Bueno, yo sé que Bessma tenía otros
know
títulos
Bessma
y
had
me gusta que haya
other
elegido este del amanecer y creo que es muy
books
importante.
or headings, but I'm glad she chose this one. She had other titles, I don't think. Optimism is not being naive, it's being militant, it's being socially, economically, and politically responsible in this area that has been mistreated. And it's also essential in the context of media projections to which we're exposed of these mobilizations as if it were all homogeneous and it's either black or white and you win or lose, and instead of taking into account the constant tension with tugs and pulls and pressure, and from overnight that block became an autumn, and then it became a winter, and then we had the funeral of the Arab Spring. It's very, of course, attractive to send these easy messages instead of following extremely complex processes of dictatorships that have been stagnated for so long. And if we've made any mistake, I'm sure it was underestimating the force of the status quo that is so deeply rooted, that is so intent on returning, on crushing any other kind of social, economic, political organization that is actually in charge of what is happening now, and not the new forces that seek a North African Middle East that are that will meet their expectations. For the first time, I like the word dawn. I myself like the word spring. They didn't, the Arab youth, the Arab population didn't say it was an Arab spring. They didn't say, oh, we feel like spring today. No, but it was the media. But still, I like it because I think that what we've lived through has to do with breaking taboos, toppling walls, and despite all the terrible, terrible things that are happening now, the walls with which I grew up in Damascus, and I only was able to whisper, communicate in whispers, and I continued to whisper when I was here in Spain, in Galicia, in Santiago de Compostela. But that's come out. That is no longer the case, and that cannot be underestimated. For the first time in 2011, now that the anniversaries are taking place, I think Bessma's overview has been very useful. For the first time in 2011, we saw that the northern Mediterranean, the north in general, looked at the south with solidarity, with empathy, after decades of media projections in which the other was associated to the south with violence, belligerence, extremisms, religious affairs, irregular migration. For the first time, the north learned from the south very useful lessons that afterwards crystallized in thousands of echoes that repeated themselves all over the Mediterranean after the uprisings. And we heard the Mediterranean South being talked about, linked to civil society, civil disobedience, resistance, non-violent resistance. The North was learning from the South about non-violent resistance. So the first time that the North was interested in the South beyond their dichotomic filters. And when complex is, of course, the process becomes complex again. You cannot go from deep-rooted dichotomies that control every single aspect and element of society and politics. You cannot overnight go on to a regular democracy as we may have in other countries. And it's also very naive for the media to think that that could have happened, that you can go from an uprising to a victory, just like that, black and white victory of democracy. So we go back. So where do we go back to when things get complicated? To the known filters against which Bessma's book attempts to respond and even act militantly against those dichotomies that the Arabs are either one or the other, one category or the other, radical or vulnerable. But of course there's also moderates. Well, the moderates we can get along with, and the radicals we can't. And everything consists of filters, filters. We have the geostrategical filter, for example. You are either with the US-Israel axis or with the Russia-Iran axis. And when we speak of geostrategy, we are subjecting these populations to having to choose between being radicals and moderate. Russia or the United States. We don't consider that there are social, political, and economic elements, and that people respond to things like things we respond to. The bread, Bessma mentioned, others such as freedom and freedom of speech. This does not form part of the current analysis of the keys of the region, but we just look at the step taken by the US, the movement, and what is the movement made by Russia. What about people? What about its citizens? I follow Syria, I follow Lebanon, Palestine. I hear the news talk about Palestine without hearing Palestinians, Lebanon without hearing the Lebanese, Syria without hearing the Syrians, without hearing what the internal tensions are that take things in one direction or another. So the geostrategic strategy, radicals, moderates, sectarian issues. The Arabs act on impulse, based on identity. They cannot understand each other. Sunni, Shia. And there was another dichotomy. I didn't know about. I didn't know who were the Shia or the Sunnis. And now I know, of course. Now I know as soon as they tell me where they're from and what they've said, because these categories are established that not only respond to reality, but are constructed realities, and to a great extent propitiate this dichotomic interpretation of citizens that are much more complex than that. In order to start finishing, everything that Bessma is saying is absolutely key to have a nuanced overall vision beyond geostrategic elements and sectarian identity filters. What are the worrying elements? What are the tensions, aspirations? What is the role? This is very important, taking into account the significant percentage of young people. What is the role of women? What is that? Or for example, questions such as, I'm sorry, it's ravaging for me to think of all the monuments destroyed by ISIS, or the so-called Islamic State, or the Syrian regime in Syria. But as important as that is the local response to that. But stories are always protagonized by those who destroy the region. We don't hear the social response. There's a rejection of those actions, or is it accepted? Is there a struggle? Is there social tension? Is there an attempt to free themselves from the civil to the military, or aren't there? No, it's only that the protagonists, normally the actors destroy, they don't build. But I don't know, Haizam, if you may want to, if you will help me here, you may want to see this website, Syria Untold. I wanted to leave you with a link, because everything that Bessma mentions about youth, women, and the importance of that social struggle in the region. A few years ago, we created a group of Syrians here in Spain to include everything that is not geostrategy, everything that is not military, everything that is not statistics, armed groups, where we want to reflect what the everyday response is, what the everyday resistance of that civil society is. Everything is ready to be shared, to be disseminated, to be translated. It is a source of news that seeks historical memory, so that what is left in the archives is not only what those who destroy leave, but those who leave, who devote their lives to that, to building their future. Thank you.
Leila, por tu contribución.
Thank you, Leila, for your contribution. It is very important to offer other narratives and to show the other side of the coin, even if it's less sexy or interesting to the media. And this is a responsibility that you have defined very well. Haizam, please. Thank you, Karim. Good evening. It's a great pleasure to be here at Casa Árabe again, and to be so well accompanied here at the panel and with the public, to talk about things that are not normally discussed in public in the normal communications channels, the immediate news, not even in forums that normally spend time thinking. But there are very many of us, of course. We know that we're speaking of very young societies, that things happened 5 years ago, and that, well, they weren't that successful in many places, and it looks like they're going back to robust authoritarianism. But of course, this is not the whole story. This is just a still photo, a photo that has gone through very many filters that have distorted it with regard to reality that photo wants to capture. We've had 5 years of disruptions in the Middle East and North Africa, and analysts have been warning non-stop that we should think the unthinkable of these societies, great disruptions, emotional somersaults. We've all gone through this emotional roller coaster. It's been about extremes in these last 5 years. And the emotions right now seem to be those of disappointment, frustration, low morale, fear, because it's not Daesh that bombards us or ISIS. It's the media that bombard us with the materials produced by Daesh and ISIS. We are bombarded on a daily basis. And that is what leads to this perception of everything being negative. As Bessma said, this does not mean that the situation is not extremely serious and that the reality isn't dire with human, physical, peaceful coexistence, destruction of all that states that have ceased to exist as such in these recent years. But the photo cannot only be that. If not, this world would be uninhabitable. We're speaking of countries that have over 350 million populations, countries in the Arab League, is what I'm counting. And it is not in the public debate or among the decision makers or politicians. They probably haven't stopped to think. Over 250 million Arabs were born after 1985 and are under 30 years of age. Over two-thirds of the Arab population is under 30 years of age. It sounds like a statistic, just a number. No, it's a reality. That is the absolute majority of the population in our immediate neighborhood. That percentage that Bessma said, who do not want to cut our head off, they don't want to have their head cut off either. They are the primary victims of the savage actions taken on behalf of the region by terrorist groups and by states that also do so. All of this, I'm saying, is to reflect that there's enormous potential there. Very young populations, the average age in very many of these countries, as was said earlier, is between 20, 23 years of age, in some countries 22. 20 years in some Arab countries, the average age. Do you understand what that means for the demographic pyramid, for the needs of its societies, for what the state needs to do or is expected to do, for the disconnect that exists between these lifelong government elites, gerontocracies that do not connect in any way with today's youth? There's an enormous break and with that. And I recommend, and I tell you, I am paid no commission for this, but Bessma Momani has made an enormous effort to include snippets of reality that is complex but is necessary to build the puzzle to understand the reality today. It's an antidote against pessimism, and it's not just that. It's out of pragmatism, need, interest. If we do not pay attention to what is positive, if we do not support those who will bring dividends to North African and Middle East countries, and therefore, consequently, for their neighbors in the north, if we do not support and follow the positive, just get ready for what can happen, because all these young people and their elders waiting for things to happen in their lives, for their lives to get better, for lives for satisfactory life cycles, that they can shine, even if it isn't much, and that they can hope for a more positive future, that they have the means to get organized, to get together, and if in this fearful, timorous Europe that closes in on itself and sets borders to people who are in extreme suffering conditions, if we take their family mementos from them, if we do not see the positive side in these neighbors, they are our immediate neighbors. Spain is the only European country that has a land border with an Arab and Muslim and African country. They're not far away. It's 14 kilometers I'm speaking of. They're right next to us. And not only physically, geographically, the human connections are always greater. Also, communities from these countries that are established here already. This means that the degrees of complexity increase, and this can be used. It can be used for different ends. They can be mediatized. They can be used politically by one side or the other, by one faction or another. That common ground, if the key understanding of the realities in our immediate vicinity needs to respond to human needs and reactions. We're not talking about aliens from outer space, and they're not that different. If we think everything is dictated to them by their religion and by their, of course, culture and religion, mark you, the economy, the international system, oil, whatever you want, you name it. But these are all human reactions, and they're all processes of modernization that have taken time in other parts of the world. They've created tensions, conflicts over 2 years of modern times, and here in societies in North Africa and the Middle East, these processes have been compressed into very few decades, during which things are being done with lots of disruptions, fluctuations, abruptly, as happened in Western Europe as well, and in the West. And we have to understand that. If we do not understand the engines of change, the drivers of change that are leading to transformations in their societies, if we only listen to the elites that we're, of course, used to listen to, we were familiar with them, we have been for very long, too long. While that does not change out of self-interest and pragmatism, in addition to the values, our values that should also be there. But Europe sometimes seems to be losing these values along the way. So even if it's only out of self-interest, the surprise that many of us received in 2011 could be tiny compared to future surprises. And the bad thing would be that these future surprises don't lead to optimism, empathy, solidarity, as they did in 2011 with the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt first. We're speaking about trying to understand, to see what the elements are there, and to try to understand what's going on, and from there to try to change policies, approaches. Those who govern through authority in these countries, international relations are based on interests more than values, aren't they? But they should understand that it's also in the interest of their own countries to open up, to be inclusive, to allow for space for the internal pressure not to burst and explode, so that this does not generate more instability beyond their borders. And if we are not capable of doing this, and I mean understanding and explaining, we will continue living with pictures of fear. We will continue mistrusting the other. We will see the other as a threat, and we will be making very bad political decisions that will only make things worse and be counterproductive. Let's hope that this is not the case, and a very useful antidote for this not to happen is this book that I hope and trust is translated into Spanish, and I hope someone here knows a publisher that translates this subject, because it would be a great contribution. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Haizam. Y bueno, gracias también.
Thank you, Haizam. And thank you also, because Haizam has been instrumental in inviting Bessma Momani to Madrid, and presenting her here at Casa Árabe. So thank you, Haizam. And before I give the floor to the public, to the audience, I would like to ask Bessma, what the main difference is for you, if there is one, if you can find one, between the countries, and I'm sorry if I once again fall into the economy trap, Leila, between the countries that went through the Arab Spring and those that didn't, or at least didn't go through these major popular uprisings, because your study, for example, also analyzes Morocco, or takes Morocco into account. So could you determine or define any differences between these countries, or between the young peoples in the different countries, and between the countries that went through an uprising process, or more violent, we could say, process, and the others, perhaps, that went through it more peacefully?
Thank you. I think it's quite interesting. There is variation, of course, and I think across the Arab countries, there is quite a bit of difference in some countries in terms of context that really is important to understanding. We talk about Tunisia as a success story. It's often rightly or wrongly viewed as such. But, it doesn't have a very strong military. That was a really important part of why we didn't see the kind of repression in the case of Egypt. Similarly, I think in the case of Syria. So there are really important contextual differences between the countries that really explain how the Arab Spring developed and changed as a result, that are really quite important. And then one can't belittle in any way. But I do think that there is and again, I say this because I expected to find a great deal of variation in the aspirations of youth. I really thought I would see, as a person who frequents the region, knows it quite intimately, and knows of the subtleties of cultural differences, from one place to the other. Beautiful differences. Not differences that are, and should be taken in a negative way, but really, I think, really interesting changes and perspectives from one country to the other. But one of the things that I found very interesting, and I saw this in places I didn't expect sometimes, was a common theme. The common themes of Arab youth really wanting better. Arab youth wanting meritocracy. This is something they kept repeating over and over again. They wanted to be given credit for their intellect. They wanted to be given credit for all of that investment in their education, right? And again, that confidence that I saw. What I saw was also women being very hungry to learn. I had the opportunity to speak at a number of universities even before writing the book. And one of the things that really stood out to me was that Arab women in particular work very hard in university. And if I can be honest, as a teacher, frankly, harder than the men. And this started to really create an interesting observation for me. In the case of, for example, Gulf countries, which I saw that very vividly, it was really surprising, because as a woman who was I was born and raised in Canada in the West with sort of a liberal feminist view of things. You go to get a degree, to get a job. This is really important. This is the progression. You get a university degree and then you go work. This is the Western liberal frame. I was meeting women in the Gulf, for example, who have some of the highest rates of unemployment of women in the workforce, I should say. But they performed and worked so hard in university. And you would start to question, I used backwards, I think, perceptions, and this is my own prejudice. Why bother, right? Why go through all that effort of getting a degree if really they know the end goal will be to stay at home? This is something that I kind of went in with my own prejudice, until I started to realize that this was, I would ask them, and they would say, I'm doing this for me. I'm getting an education for me to hold my head up high in my society, in my family. I'm not doing this for society. I'm doing this for me, right? And that fact that women were struggling, and I would say pushing so many boundaries, asking really great questions in the universities, and wanting to learn and soak up all this knowledge, was because it was the few times in the world that they were given the opportunity to be judged on their merits, right? Think about this. Anywhere else and everywhere else in society, they're the daughter of X, they're the wife of X. They're not given the opportunity to shine. In university, it's the one place where, as a professor, a 76 is a 76, and 84 is an 84. And that sort of I think, deep quest for knowledge is something we have failed to capture in understanding Arab youth. And that's one thing that really stood out to me in all of my interviews, especially with women. I mean, it really was something that was quite heartening to see that young women were holding on to their education with an amazing amount of pride. An amazing amount of pride. So that's something that I think is important. But yes, the context from place to place differs, and the challenges that each of them face are completely different. And that's one of the things I think that, the book tries to look at the nuance, but there wasn't enough time to go through case by case to see how much, the struggle of a woman in southern Egypt is completely different than the struggle of a woman in Qatar. I mean, I recognize that there are deep inherent challenges and contexts. But if I could also, one of the things that, and I'm sure that Leila knows this really well, but this stood out to me. We talk about Syria, but one of the things that I think, and I still see this in many of the young Syrian activists today, are the movements on the ground to govern themselves in ways, particularly in liberated areas, in ways that make any sort of democracy, be put to shame in terms of what they're doing on the ground. 300, the flourishing of magazines in liberated areas in Syria is phenomenal. The kinds of conversations that are happening in these, the white helmets, these amazing stories of volunteers, right? These were students and young people who learned how to be firefighters, who learned how to be ambulance, paramedics, basic medicine. They are basically, I think, resisting the regime in such interesting ways that we would never capture if we only looked through the lens of the jihadists. If we didn't notice that there are these activities going on where young people are putting their intelligence and their skills to great use. So I think there are more of these kinds of stories. And I know that we all have a hard time of seeing connection with these stories, but there's this great Arab proverb, and I said it in the front of my book, because it was to me that really the impetus of wanting to do this. My grandmother taught me this great Arab proverb of shar ala shara bi'amlu lihya. Add a hair to a hair, you eventually get a beard. Right? And this is the point. If you look across the region, there are all these things happening. What's the mosaic that comes out of it? Or this tableau is a form of resistance that I think is very powerful. And eventually, they will be in forms of, or they will be in positions of decision making that I think has to be reckoned with. I think this is the core essence. There's only one certainty in life, and that's people die. As awful as that sounds. So those geriatric rulers that you're talking about, they have to go. They will not last. We know that's as a fact of humanity. And so in some way, we have to just be optimistic that in 10 to 15 years, when those young people are in the positions of democracy, or I should say in the positions of authority and technocrats and decision makers, they will not put up with the past system. Because they never benefited from the past system. This is key, right? They weren't the ones benefiting from the past system. The system of crony capitalism, the system of favoritism, the system of wasta, they're not benefiting from it. This is a system that has completely failed them, right? It maybe helped their fathers, but it's not helping them because it's so broken today. And so they have no patience for this old system of regime or governance.
Gracias. Nota para el intérprete Wasta.
Wasta is having connections, by the way. And I don't know if you have any questions here. If not, we can go on to the audience again. This talk attempts, of course, in a very minute way, because it's it's just us here, and it isn't in an hour, and it isn't the television at big time, but the reductionism of these stereotypes that are one of the tools, one of the less useful tools to understand the region, but that our people grab onto because because it enables them to disqualify the other, dehumanize the other, and just see it as another number. And we here at Casa Árabe a year ago, with Friedrich Debert, Foundation organized a lecture. Leila was here, insisting on other aspects, this social entrepreneurship, the initiatives with citizens' participation, political, yes, but also in the participatory Morocco, mental health, which is so often forgotten, and that interests me so much, speaking of the health problems we have in the region, and that this also affects the development in these countries, initiatives for job creation amongst young people, and to try to diversify the narrative, and how important it is to know how complex and varied our societies are. Basma's book, she's brought a few books with her, will be sold right now. She may even sign it for you, and thank you to the interpreters for their work. You're welcome. Analysts, fantastic, who always make this debate more substantial. And I'd also like to finally announce that the day after tomorrow, there's a lecture at 7 on Thursday on the Syrian refugee crisis. It's the third in a series of lectures. In the first, we talked about the response by NGOs. The second, the countries in the region, the neighboring countries, Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon. And this Thursday, we will be talking about the response by the Gulf countries. This is novel. We will have 5 ambassadors, 2 women ambassadors, and 3 ambassadors from the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman. So that is a novelty. We would like to invite you to come. We also have our movies on Friday, Beyond Tahrir, the site, and our website is casaarabe.com. Thank you very much.